Everyone has an opinion, but in general, we tend to view the problem from one of two angles, in a spiritual sense or a scientific one, and it's quite rare that those two meet. Every so often, though, they do come together, and the result is an intriguing and captivating portrayal of what it really means to die. Dr. Mary Neal is a qualified spinal surgeon. She's also a devout Christian, and she claims to have truly come back from the dead. She has written 2 books about what happened to her, given countless interviews, delivered a TED Talk, and featured as part of a Netflix series, Surviving Death. For many, her experiences rank among the surest evidence out there that perhaps death isn't the end. Her story starts in 1999, along an isolated stretch of river in Chile, South America. Neal had been kayaking as part of a group when she got into trouble, got pinned under the water, and was separated from everyone else. Seconds turned to minutes, but she was still entirely submerged. And Neal says that her physical body changed color as she actually died. She says it was 30 minutes between when she was first submerged and when she eventually received CPR. And yet she lived to tell the tale. Initially, when she regained consciousness, Neal recalls how those who had been trying to save her, the others in her kayaking group, were shocked. So much had happened, and so much time had passed, that no one thought she'd make it. And yet she did. And what she experienced in the time in between would ultimately shape her from that point forward. Neal claims to have ascended to a place that she calls heaven. She recalls there being an apparent path leading the way, that it was as though her surroundings were woven with love, and that she quickly encountered various spiritual beings. There was an indescribable feeling of energy and color. She says that she held a conversation with Jesus Christ, and wholly felt as though she had returned home. So much so that Neal didn't actually want to be sent back to her body on Earth. In interviews, she's explained that although she has a family whom she loves, she only returned here because she had to, because the spiritual beings that she met insisted that it wasn't her time yet. Given the choice, she'd have stayed. That's how apparently good this other place was. Meanwhile, Neal remembers being able to witness all that was happening to her physical body while she drowned beneath the surface of the Chilean river. She had turned purple and bloated, but was still trapped right up until her seeming spiritual essence returns to the scene. Then her body was freed and, somewhat miraculously, was floated downriver towards the rest of her group. Now was when they could recover her from the water and begin CPR before eventually bringing her back to life. But the apparent miracles didn't end there. In her books and again during interviews and speeches, Neal tells of how 2 young Chilean men appeared as soon as she was brought back around. This in itself was incredible given that she and the rest of the kayakers were now in an extremely isolated location, on the side of the river surrounded by dense bamboo forest, and miles away from the nearest towns and even roads. It should have been highly unlikely to meet anyone at any time, let alone meeting exactly who you needed precisely when you needed them. Neal says that the 2 men loaded her body onto one of the kayaks and helped carry her away. One even happened to have a machete on them to cut through the thicket. Still, when they reached the road, the odds should really have remained against them. Neal had just been revived from literally drowning. She also had multiple broken bones. Her body had been put through an intense, incomparable ordeal, and she was in urgent need of medical attention. It was unfathomably fortunate then that she and the group transporting her happened across an ambulance parked at the side of the road at just that moment. Again, they were otherwise stranded in the middle of nowhere, so it was immensely lucky that this ambulance was there. Some might call it a godsend, while Neal herself has before referred to the 2 Chilean men as angels. From this point, Neal was successfully taken to a hospital where she spent weeks before recording a full recovery. Having been under the water and deprived of oxygen for so long, all predictions were that she should have sustained major brain damage, but in reality, she didn't suffer anything like that. According to her testimony, she had certainly died, but she came back unscathed and, if anything, was changed for the better. In 2018, Neal presented a TED Talk explaining how death brings context to life. In it, she refers back to an experience from her childhood, when she was sent to a summer camp, but despite all of the many happy memories she made there, she was glad to return to her family home once the camp had ended. For Neal, ever since her near or after-death experience, this is much like how she has come to view life in general, as though at the end of life, we're all set to return back to some higher, spiritual, more comfortable place. In the meantime, there are memories to be made, and as Neal directly attests to, there are challenges to be faced, because there's one final and somewhat unsettling element to her story. the seemingly foreseen early death of her eldest son. At some point during her transcendental experience, while her body was still stuck at the bottom of the river, Neil says that she learned that her oldest son would die. Upon returning to this life, this was the one part she reportedly didn't reveal to anyone else. Of course, she had hoped that it would somehow change over time, and that her son would survive. However, around a decade after what happened in Chile, her son did die in a car accident. So what do you think of the case of Dr. Mary Neal? As her public profile has risen in recent years, there are many who have cast doubt over the claims that she has made. Perhaps significantly, there's also a more recent message below her official TED Talk upload on YouTube. A note from TED which reads, quote, "We've flagged this talk because it appears to fall outside TEDx's curational guidelines. This talk only represents the speaker's personal experiences," end quote. Of course, one counter-argument asks, can the experience of death ever be anything other than a personal experience? That talking about death arguably has to be this way because there's no other way to make sense of it. Again, what do you think? Today, Neal is certainly more well known as a successful author writing about her near-death experience than as the specialist surgeon that she had initially trained to be. Her life headed in an all-new direction after that fateful trip to South America. As such, she often refers back to her previous mindset as a way of suggesting that she understands how her claims could be questioned or dismissed by some, perhaps even most people. But for those who do follow and believe what she says, the consistency of her story is often widely commented on. The key parts have never really changed or been embellished. And given that she had been with others when the kayaking incident happened, there seemingly are people and witnesses who can confirm her account, or at least the parts of it that happened down here on Earth. What really happens after we die? If you're prepared to accept Mary Neal's experience, then there's some kind of heightened state, bathed in love, waiting for us when our time runs out. A walk with God? Perhaps. An ascension to heaven? Apparently so. But if you find yourself there and your time actually hasn't run out, you're sent back with just a little bit more life to lead.